Our first speaker is Dr. Jennifer Walker. And Dr. Walker graduated from UC Davis, practicing on California dairies before earning her PhD at The Ohio State. And Dr. Jen spent 15 years in the supply chain leading animal welfare and milk quality programs for Dean Foods and then Danone North America. Along the way, she completed her master's in animal welfare ethics, policy, and law at the University of Edinburgh. Today, she returned to the barnyard as the co-founder and chief animal welfare officer of Kinder Ground, a fund for good dedicated to supporting the farming community to elevate the welfare of animals in food production. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Walker.
Are you good? Solid. You're good. I'll test that. Awesome. Thank you guys so very much. And I really appreciate the invitation to kick things off. I'll start everything with the formality of the conflict of interest, right? So I do represent Kinder Ground. We are a 501c3 registered in the state of Tennessee. And as such, we do accept donations from various businesses, persons, and granting agencies. If you want more information regarding donors, my past employment, salary or lack thereof, please feel free to email info@KinderGround, and I'm happy to answer any questions regarding that. But let's get back into animal welfare audits, their applications and limitations. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to kick off this day and this, what I think is an important discussion about how we can really continue our work, because I think there's been a lot of work done on how we develop a more compassionate food system, okay? All right, let's go. Where is it going? All right, so I have a little roadmap set out for today, just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. Also, to keep me on track, as Dakota will know, I tend to get a little excited. But so the first thing we're going to do is talk about some definitions, just to make sure we level set, so you understand where I'm coming from, because I think it's important to recognize we all bring our biases to the table, right? So we'll get those out on the table, and you can understand exactly where I'm coming from. Then I'm going to talk about what makes a good audit, at least from my perspective and experience in the supply chain, because not all audits are created equal, as Paco would well know. Let me move closer. Oh, I need to hit the button with intention. Next, we're going to talk about what makes a meaningful program, right? So a little different than the audit. And then lastly, we're going to wrap up with applications and limitations of audits. We're going to do, again, reflect on my experience with audits, certifications, and all those things. And really what I see are some considerable limitations and some honest criticisms, at least from my, as they say, in my humble opinion, maybe not so humble. So let's get started with some definitions. All right. So let's talk about animal welfare. You'd think there is one great definition. This is a boots on the ground perspective. So I'm going to talk about animal welfare today the way I talk about animal welfare to farmers, right? Nothing against the 5 freedoms and the 5 domains and all that lovely stuff, but we're gonna, the 5s, I do not talk about when I talk to farmers, because there's nothing that'll elicit an eye roll better than talking about the 5 freedoms or the 5 domains to a farmer, right? So when I talk about animal welfare, I talk about it in 3 basic buckets to farmers, right? Bucket number 1 are the basics, and that is abuse, neglect, timely euthanasia, care of moribund animals, animals with severe conditions, right? And honestly, when I talk to farmers, this is the AKA, don't be a jerk, right? That's all I'm asking. This isn't hard. Don't be a jerk. And honestly, depending on the farmer audience, I might not use the word jerk. But those are the basics. Reasonable expectations, non-negotiables, right? These are non-negotiables from the perspective of any animal experiencing it and consumers, customers, the average audience seeing it, right? So we got to cover the basics, okay, at the very least. The second bucket is animal health. And this is the one where I think we're most comfortable talking about animal welfare. Farmers get this. We're talking about, general health, we want to know that disease and injury is managed, right? Minimal. Animals have access to food and water, protection from the elements, really the basics. And so much so that I think we tend to get a little bit myopic, right, around animal welfare. And we focus on this a wee bit too much and giving it probably a little bit too much weight. And it limits our thinking beyond the next step, but important nonetheless. The last one would be nature. I need to make sure I'm close enough, apparently. So nature, this is the behavioral needs of the animals, what the animal is experiencing. This includes pain, addressing those highly motivated behaviors, enrichment, and again, from a farmer perspective and speaking to them, quality of life, right? What does that look like? And this is honestly something that is not addressed in most programs or audits. We are only beginning to touch on this as an animal agricultural industry, and partly because it's hard. We need to figure out how to look at it. It's certainly hard to measure. We're trying to figure out that. It's hard to prove things. People always want to know, like, what's the bottom line? Does it make us any money? Does it save us any money? And these are complex questions to measure and to answer, right? So it hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, partly because it's a challenge, but partly because it's that softer part, I'd say, of what we're talking about. And most importantly, what I think the challenge is that it, above all of the things we do, goes back to the definition that was mentioned, is that above all else, we have to remember that animal welfare is about the individual, which is a challenge because we evaluate animal welfare of the herd, right? We talk about these numbers, right? But above all, animal welfare is about the individual and what it's experiencing. And that, above all else, ties into that nature. Because let's also recall or recognize that animals aren't a monolithic thing. Like, just as we could look at this, I am an introvert, hard to believe. There are introverted animals. There are extroverted animals, right? So we have to recognize in the systems we're building, we tend to build systems for a monolithic idea of what a cow is or a chicken is or a pig is. And we need to start thinking about how do we build systems that actually recognize the individuality of animals, but that are still businesses that we can make money on, because let's be honest, we're in the business of business, right? So we can't lie about that, right? So it's a sticky wicket and a challenge we're gonna try to see if we can face. All right, our next definition, audits and programs. An audit is not a program. An audit is a tool. Okay, that is important to remember. An audit is just the tool. It is an important tool. It is a vital tool. Okay, we have to start with that. But the tool is just what we use to set the expectation. It is how we measure success and progress. And above all, when written well, when designed well, and executed well, it creates consistency in how we train people to do the audit. It creates consistency in how we execute the audit from one farm to the next, from 1 year to the next, right? So very important. So an audit is not a program, but an audit is a vital tool to our success. The program is essential, right? But the program is the process. The program is what ensures accountability. It creates that path to improvement. It has to adapt to the science, to the community, to our public audience, right? It communicates our goals, and it should communicate our progress, because it has to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable. And above all, an effective program has to provide support, and that's going to tie into the boots in the ground conversation. And this will come back, I'll come back to this, but the important part to recognize is that there are a lot of audits being done out there. Very few of them are tied to a program. Okay, so again, what I hope to do in this next 40 minutes is to equip you guys with some, especially for those of you who work in the supply chain, to start asking some critical questions when it comes to certification and audits. Because it's one thing to have an audit tool, it's another thing to have a great audit tool, but where's the program, right? Because an audit without an effective program is just an exercise in box checking, okay? All right. And if you take nothing else away from this talk today, as it ties into boots on the ground, one thing to recognize is that audits do not improve welfare. People do. Above all else, it's the people that make the difference. All right, our last bit of definitions are about the types of audits. I know a lot of, this might be getting in the weeds. 3 types of audits. We have internal, second party, and third party. Internal audits are those done by the folks within the farm or the business. So this might be the veterinarian, the nutritionist. You know, when I worked for Dean Foods, or if you're with a co-op, I should say. If you're with a co-op doing the audit, that would technically be a first party audit. A second party audit would be the audits done by the buyer or some external kind of nonpartisan or folks. So when I worked for Dean Foods in Danone, when I worked with the farmers, those would be considered second party audits. And with those kind of audits, you have the opportunity to give feedback, to work with them, to give them ideas, to really expand on the audit and the results. Third party audits are to be done by independent folks outside of the organization, right? And a third party audit is done with this limitation that they're not there to give advice. They're just there to assess the situation as they see it today and report back to whoever asked them to do the audit. Oopsie daisy, pushed too hard. Let's go back. Go back. There we go. All right, so what makes an effective program is that it incorporates all 3 of these. This is what Temple refers to as her 3-legged stool. Right, so an effective program needs to incorporate an internal audit, a third party, and a second party audit. Right, so just keep that in mind as we move forward. And again, on the third party side, ideally, I'll come back to this, but third party audits should avoid conflicts of interest, which means who pays for the audit matters, right? So if a farmer is paying an auditor, that's an automatic conflict of interest, right? So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. All right, let's get on to what makes a good audit. What makes a good audit is a good standard, the audit tool, that's what we're talking about. But more importantly, what makes a meaningful standard or audit tool? And so in my experience, in my opinion, a meaningful standard requires all of these elements. And we're going to take a deeper dive to each one of them. All right, a meaningful standard defines the scope. And what do I mean by that? It should clearly state what it includes, right? So for example, for a dairy, if it's a dairy audit, it needs to be specific. Who are we checking? Are we only checking lactating cows? There are audits that do that. Are we checking every age group? Are we making sure to check the heifer facility that's 15 miles down the road? Do we include the calf ranch that the calves are sent to? Are there these black boxes that we often forget about? Do we include transport to the sale yard? Do we include the heifer raiser that might not just be 20 miles away, it might be in a different state, right? How about the bulls? Where is this semen coming from? So there's going to be some black boxes in a lot of audits, but I think it's very important that an audit tool recognize what are we not covering, right? So we need to recognize. So in poultry, this might be the fact that you're not assessing, like where's the seed stock or the breeding stock or this isn't the case going to left. I don't know anything about chickens, but like the pullets or like what are we missing in the audit? For pork, it might be because we're auditing the sow barn, right? Are we looking at where the finishing unit is or, where? So it's just important to make sure we're clear on that. And ideally, it should be as comprehensive as possible, right? But that's not always easy. Second, it should be outcome-based. And this is really important because, and when I say outcome-based, I mean looking at things like foot pad lesions. We often look at locomotion scores. We look at body condition. This is critical because what this means is that we're not so focused on dictating the style of the system, the dimensions of the system. That can be important, right? So I think it's fine to say, like, we have no gestation crates, no battery cages, no tie stalls for dairy, right? But the reality is all of those systems, even, I would say better systems, whether it's free stalls, open housing system, looking at the outcomes lets us get less obsessed about the dimensions. And what it focuses on is how effectively is managing the system regardless of the design. I'm not so excited about the design, and with some limitations, than I am how do we manage it, right? Because even the best designs, poorly managed, are going to result in poor welfare. So when we focus on outcomes, that alleviates all of those issues, right? So outcome-based is critical in a well-designed audit tool. Then we need to define those criteria. So we will have outcome measures. Some of those will be what we call key welfare indicators. So we need to identify those because within each species, there are some key welfare indicators we need to make sure we check. But they also have to be aligned with goals, right? And what I mean by that is we have to use the data. There should be data that tells us how should we set the goal. And we're going to come back to this a little bit, but those goals should be informed not only by the data, but what are you trying to achieve, right? So for an example, if we want to improve the welfare of dairy cattle, and we know that the average dairy has 25% lame cows, if we want to improve welfare, should we set the goal to the average or set the goal to maybe the top 25%, right? An example would be tail docking. If we know that the top 10% of farms can achieve a injured tail, sorry, not tail docking, tail injuries, if we know that the top 10% of dairies can have less than 1% injured tails, I think that's a reasonable goal to set, to share as a benchmark with producers. But I'm not sure that it's a reasonable goal to enforce, right? So I think when we use the data, we can effectively create benchmarks to drive better behavior in farmers to say, well, here's the top 10%. Here's what the top 10% can do. So you can tell them what's possible. I think it's important to show farmers what can be achieved, right? But then we can say, but we should at least be aiming for the top 25%. Because really, if you aim for the middle, really the only improvement we're going to see is at that bottom, right? Which is important, but I'm not sure that that's advancing welfare in the way that we would expect. And then weighting. Now, a lot of folks will associate weighting with a point-based audit system. I'm going to confess my bias. I do not like point-based audits. They drive me batty. I think it is impossible to create a meaningful point-based system that accurately reflects. Really what they do is all it ends up doing is identifying the non-negotiables. So they, humane euthanasia ends up getting 1,000 points. So you fail. So it doesn't just say, it doesn't have to have points, just say you have to do it. So, but the critical part is you have to create this weighting, and by weighting, it can simply be this item requires immediate action. This item must be addressed within a week, a month, 3 months, right? And there might be other items that you say, okay, you need to put this on your long-term plan. Maybe we need to make sure we address it in the next 2 to 3 years. And that can be appropriate weighting. We don't need to come up with crazy algebra to make ourselves feel better. Now, I recognize that farms do like a grade. So the ones that are pretty competitive, they'll often say, like, well, how'd I do? I'm like, you're doing great. And like, but if you could give a grade, would I get an A? And I'm like, oh, Lord. But that's where benchmarking comes in. So when we use the data, we can benchmark, and we can tell a farm, like, you are in the top 10%. And even better, I can tell them, you're in the top 1% of tails, but man, you're in the bottom 25% of locomotion. And that's much more effective than saying, hey, you got a B, right, overall, right? So let's collect data and use data that can help drive improvement on the farm by motivating farmers and meet them where they're at. Metrics. Again, these metrics have to be reasonable and actionable, right? So this gets back to using the data. How do we use the data? In order to do that, We have to create platforms that can show the data. There's so many audits that are done where the farmers actually have no idea what just happened. They know they got their certificate. They know they got the best score, right? But if we're going to improve welfare and we're going to empower farmers to improve, we need to have, again, realistic. So again, is it realistic to set a goal to the top 10%? I would argue probably not. But it also has to be something they can fix, right? So that's the important part. Are we actually measuring things that they can take action on? Accountability. Every audit tool should clearly define who is responsible for what. This is critical. Who's responsible for setting up the time, setting up the audit, performing the audit, providing the report, communicating to the farmer the results and the expectations moving forward. This is key. It also should involve accountability at the farm level. And what this usually means is the paperwork, the SOPs, the training, and this goes in there partly because it's a recognition that there's lots of things that we want to look at or consider in animal welfare that during a farm visit or an audit, we're not going to be able to witness. We're not going to be able to witness. We're not always going to be able to witness how something is euthanized. There's not always going to be moribund animals there to check on. So when that's not there, we at least have an SOP to talk to them about, right? So there's just that backup plan. While we're focused on outcomes, there is that recognition that outcomes aren't always available for what we want. Lastly is culture, right? A good tool requires that there's an internal process, internal auditing, right, to create that culture on the farm that animal welfare is important, and it incorporates training and requires training. Okay. Lastly is revision, right? So we need to keep the tool sharp, right? And this doesn't just mean every 3 years updating it. This means annually looking at it, reviewing it. This means talking with the team that's executing the audit, making sure that questions are clarified. Is that working? Reviewing the results. That was my job, is to make sure that people are consistently executing each question. And I often find like there's confusion. Like, how are we answering this question? And so quarterly, at least, go through and make sure we're calibrating on the audit. And then yearly update, clarify confusion, and then at least 3 years, go through a major overhaul, make sure we're up to date. And that's where having an external advisory council is helpful to advise. You know, I can't keep up on every little thing in welfare. So I rely on people smarter than me to help me figure out what we need to focus on and challenge me to think a little bit different as well to do that. All right, so that is what gives us a good audit tool. Next, we want to talk about what makes a meaningful program. Meaningful assurance programs, I think, have to have some key things. What do these look like? Okay. Any meaningful assurance program has these elements. They will have explicit goals that are very clear and explicit. They will have a robust standard, the audit tool. They have to have integrity in the training and the process. It has to have accountability, including transparency and reporting. It has to have boots on the ground. It has to have that on-farm support. And it has to have the goal of making a difference and making it better. These are the essential elements of a meaningful program. Okay, and by that I mean I do see a lot of programs. Like I said, I see a lot of tools without a program, and then I see some interesting programs that might hit on 1 or 2 of these things, but very rarely have I actually seen a program that really encompasses all of these elements. We're going to go through these one by one. The goals, all right? These are important. Anytime a company has come to me, or in either of the jobs that I've had, of course, they hire their token veterinarian because they want to manage welfare, and then they're like, okay, what are we going to do? And they all get frustrated. They've always gotten frustrated because I just come back to them with a question, and I say, I don't know, what do you want to do? And they're like, well, you're the welfare person. You're supposed to tell us what to do. I'm like, well, what I do depends on what you want, right? And a lot of them haven't really thought this through, to be honest. So in my experience, companies can have 1 to 4 goals, right? The first goal is to mitigate risk. We're all familiar with this, right? So to do this, you first need to identify the risk. And as a company, you either need to decide to remove it or rehabilitate it, right? And the mitigating risk is a huge driver, right, to farms. So those of you who come to welfare from the quality side understand that, right? So risk mitigation is a huge part in what we do. The second one we do is to convey commitment, right? And so in today's terms, we'd call this virtue signaling. And sometimes this is done to alleviate pressure or in response to some sort of campaign or whatever. But other times it is about to signal leadership, where a company genuinely wants to demonstrate leadership in this space. The fourth potential goal is what I call brand affection. So driving market share or finding a way to create some brand differentiation. This is generally where the marketing team comes in. They get all excited about this. Which I think is important and something we can leverage in animal welfare. And lastly, and sadly, the least common goal of most of them is actually to improve animal welfare. The goal behind this can vary depending on who you talk to in the business. So improving animal welfare actually is a great way to secure future supply, right? So let's work with the best farms. Let's, if you're looking at procurement, I want farms that don't cause me headaches. So improving welfare can help you do that. It ensures that you have great suppliers into the future. So there's one good reason to improve welfare. Another reason to improve welfare is to demonstrate leadership. My reason to improve welfare is to do good, right? So that's my motivation, is I'm supposed to leave the world better than I found it. So the key is trying to work across the company, right? So, and align the company. So you got to get procurement at the table. You got to get quality at the table. You got to get marketing at the table. And you got to get the senior leadership at the table. And you tell me what you want. Once you know what I know what you want, then I can design the program. Because depending on where they land here, the program I design is going to be very different. Right, meaningful standards, we already talked about this. So in order to have a meaningful program, you have to have a good tool, right? So I won't go over that again. Integrity, very important to a good program, a meaningful program. How do we ensure integrity, right? First things first, we have an audit tool. Talked about that. We have an audit tool that has complete instructions. I cannot have audits done that vary from farm to farm, by person to person, right? That is and it happens a lot, right? So we have to have a good audit tool with complete instructions on how to execute it and follow up. That audit tool does have to make sure that we have a clearly defined sampling process that includes accounting for seasonality, geography, and bias, because there is a lot of bias, right? So we have to make sure that we have a good sampling strategy clearly defined so that it's done the same audit after audit, no matter who's doing the auditing. We need to make sure that the audit and the folks are trained how to verify, right? So how to do a good interview, right? To make sure that how the SOPs are being done are actually done, right? How to observe, how to record, how to take good notes, how to look at records. Critically, not just to say, like, do you have drug records? Like, show me, like, they're my drug records, right? How do I actually look into those and see if they're actually being recorded correctly, right? So these are critical things that folks, that need to be incorporated into the audit. And lastly, with all of those, none of that does any good if we don't have qualified auditors, right? And that starts with PACO certification. But it doesn't end there. I think a lot of folks don't realize the work that it takes once folks are PACO certified Like for my team, it's quarterly calibration because it's not Paco's job to make sure that I calibrate my team to my audit, right? So that's quarterly meetings with my team, going over results, seeing where we're inconsistent about some things, results that don't make sense to me, clarifying questions, making sure, listening to the team when they tell me, Jen, we're having a really hard time doing this, and then figuring out why, you know, and how do we make adjustments? How do we fix that? And that goes back into updating the tool. So people don't seem to appreciate the amount of time and effort, energy, and cost that goes into doing this, right? So, but critically important, qualified auditors and then well-trained and calibrated auditors moving forward. Accountability. All right, first things first, I'm going to go back to, and I am not a paid sponsor of Paco, just so you know, but I am a fan, but there is no money being exchanged. But the first things first is to have a certified published audit. And Paco is the only folks that I know that certify audits. But then to put it out there, let people look at it. Let people read it. If those who are interested, not many are going to dig that deep, but it should be publicly available. Second is that you have to have a reporting platform. I see so many audits that are done on paper that are turned in and at best entered into a spreadsheet. But there should be a platform. There should be data shared. There should be a dashboard. And for you to look at it at the farm level, the business level, geographically, things so that you know where you need to make action and set priorities, but also ways that we can summarize it in ways to protect farmer anonymity, right? But we can share it with the public or your customer. How are you doing? Have you actually made any progress? And being honest about your challenges. How many corrective actions have you made? How many farms have you had to remove from your supply, if any? We have to develop, and those are not cheap. I will say, again, this costs money. Having developed 2 of them, they're a challenge, they take some time, and they take money to support. Secondly, those results have to be reviewed with the farmer, and in partnership with the farmer, a plan developed that we all agree to. I see too many farmers where I show up and ask them how they're doing. They don't even know that they had an audit. They're not sure there were the results. They know they passed. Yeah, I don't know. I got my certificate. They're still picking up the milk, the chickens, the eggs, whatever they are, right? But at the end of an audit, there should be an exit interview. If you go to Paco training, you'll learn that. You have an exit interview. But there should be a report. And there should be somebody. If it's a third party, it's not their job to figure that out. But that's where the second party, that boots in the ground. The boots on the ground should sit there and go over the results with the farmers and figure out, so what? Like, why did we just do this, right? I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Lastly, we do need to share the progress with stakeholders. That comes into the necessity of a reporting platform. But again, we do need to let folks know how we're doing. Our customers want to know, and we need good data to prove it. And lastly, you should have an advisory group. Those are the folks that should review your progress and advise you on next steps. They're the ones responsible for knowing, like, the leading research and giving you advice on how to do that. I think folks from academia are important to have that, but also people steeped in the action of doing it, right? So I'm not going to lie, there was many times during our advisory council meetings where the little academic said, well, you need to do this and this and this. And I'm like, well, that's fine. You know, I'm not going to make it a requirement yet, right? So envision the plan, because if they heard it once, they heard it twice when I said, I still have to buy milk. Like, you can't make it impossible for me to buy milk. Like, this is the reality we live in. We still have to procure a product, right? But that's where the advisory group, a well-managed advisory group, is going to push you, right? And you're going to push back, but they're going to keep you honest. They're going to know what to do with the data, and they're going to see some cracks in the system. So that's all good. Keep walking away. And lastly is preparation and follow-up, right? And this is another one of those things that I think folks don't recognize at all, or just fail to underestimate, or not fail, they do underestimate the amount of time energy, and resources that go into preparing for an audit that is successful and useful, and then the follow-up, right? So when we're done, do I go back? Who's going back in 30 days? What if I have to go back in, maybe it's one of those non-negotiables and I have to go back in 24 hours. Maybe I have to go back in 48. Maybe I have to go back every month, right? And so the amount of time that it takes from the team to manage the follow-up, to record all the stuff, to work with the farmers, I would say is probably the most underestimated or simply not recognized parts of developing a meaningful program. All right, for the topic of today, boots on the ground. This is critical. And this is the one thing that is just overlooked or underappreciated or undervalued in most of these programs. The boots on the ground. So these aren't the auditors. These aren't the auditors. Boots on the ground is the staff. This is the second party. These are the folks that are getting the work done. These are the folks that have the knowledge, that get to build relationships, and most importantly, build trust with the farmers. This takes time, right? Time. This takes presence on the farm, and it does take that knowledge, credibility to listen to what they're saying. It also takes skin in the game. And by this, I mean money, essentially, right? And effort, right? So to support the staff, but also to support the decisions, right? So if you're working with a farmer and they're having some serious issues, how are we going to help them fix it? Are we going to help rehabilitate the farm? Are we going to spend the time and energy to get out there and guide them through and walk them through the process? It might be the ultimate skin in the game, which is going to cost the business money if we have to say, you know what, farm, you just can't seem to meet the moment, and we're going to have to cut you off. And that may cost procurement some money because, you know what, we really need milk right now. I've heard that time and time again. You know, we need the milk, Jen. But there has to be some form of skin in the game where we decide how we're going to do that. Like, okay, you need the milk? Fine. Then what are we going to do to fix it? Right? So that's important. With all of that, then and only then can those boots on the ground prioritize what we need to work on and make progress. Because the reality is, at the end of an audit, I might have 20 things to work on. And I'm going to sit down with the farmer, and I'm going to pick 3. And those 3 may be different from farm to farm. You can take the exact same audit results, but depending on the farm, their situation, their interests, what are they excited about? I'm going to sit down and say, here's what we're going to work on. And I usually pick a short-term goal and then a couple long-term goals to say, well, let's just work on this first, right? Make it manageable. Let them have a win, for Pete's sake. Let them feel like progress is possible, right? And help them figure out what that looks like. And if we do all this, we can be crisis ready from the business. Not going to say we're going to avoid every crisis at all. You can guarantee there's going to be a problem. I promise you. There's going to be a problem. But if we have all of this, if we have the data, if we have the receipts, as they say, to back it up, we can navigate any crisis. That, I am sure, when we design and run and support the program effectively, we can navigate any crisis, okay? And then last but not least is making a difference. And the key here seems obvious, like, of course you want to make a difference, Jen. And what I found over the last few years is where I failed in understanding that making a difference. What we had to decide is, do we want to make a short-term difference? So who here has watched Ted Lasso, right? So my concern is what I'm finding with the way most of our programs and audits and industry programs have been run is that we've fostered what I call the goldfish mentality. So in Ted Lasso, that's that 3-second memory, right? You forget. And so that works great if you want to win a soccer game, apparently. It is not great if you want farmers to continue to do what you're doing when people leave, when people move on, when things change, when nobody's no longer checking that thing, right? And so The key here is making a difference. Do you want to make it short-term or sustained? And if we want to create sustained change, we need to change hearts and minds. We don't need to just create what I call this, what we've done is we've created a box-checking mentality, compliance, right? So a meaningful program is going to think, how do I actually get farmers to do these things? Not just when I'm looking, right? We get that idea like, what does it say? Like integrity is when you, like what you do when no one's looking, right? Too many farmers know to clean up the stuff before we get there for the audit, right? I don't want that. I just want them to do stuff when I'm not there, right? So let's see, we're going to put a pin in this and come back in a minute. All right, we're getting to the end of the journey. So let's talk about what does all this mean? All right, so we're going to go back to these goals. We talked about here are the goals that we can have in our program. The trick is how do we get to them, right? And different programs or different approaches get there in different ways. And I see 4 different approaches in the supply chain. For the first is the promise, which is pretty basic, that pinky swear. Those are quite common. The second approach is to go with certification. The third one is to enforce an actual standard. Like I said, the last one would be a meaningful program, and those I would say are few and far between. With the promise, you actually you certainly convey a commitment. Again, I'm not sure what it means. You may get some brand affection from that, maybe not. But that's about it, right? And we're not going to talk much more about the promise because they're pretty useless. So I'm not going to give them too much time. We're going to spend a good bit of time talking about certification. Certifications can mitigate risk depending on how they're done. They could also create risk. So that's why it's gray. Certainly conveys a commitment. May or may not generate some brand affection. I think very few of them have delivered in that regard. Animal welfare improvement, not so much. We're going to talk about that. Enforce standard. Certainly, when enforced, this is the key, when the standard is enforced, right? It's not when the standard is there and then procurement pushes back and complains about the results and says you didn't do it right, or I don't know. There's all kinds of reasons to push back on the audit results. When we enforce the standard, we can mitigate risk. We can certainly convey a commitment. I'm not sure you can do much on brand affection because honestly, most of the industry standards are the bar is pretty low. I would say most of the industry standards address that basic bucket. So if the bar is don't be a jerk, I'm not sure that brand affection is going to be high. So we'll have to consider that. And then the last one is improve welfare. And again, if enforced, it can improve welfare. A meaningful program, I would say, could do all 4. The trick here is to recognize, to be honest, that as you move across these approaches, cost significantly increases in managing the program. The bonus is that risk significantly decreases. So that's the argument to make. This is also why I tend to think that animal welfare should live, does well when it lives in the quality department, because quality is used to managing risk. That's our job. And we also spend a lot of money doing it. All right, so let's just dig into certification. I'm going to poke at certifications here for a bit, so I apologize to anybody who's here representing a certification, but get used to disappointment, I guess. Certification said we can achieve all these things. Now, animal welfare is not unique in certification criticism, right? There's plenty of examples across the landscape that have shown that certifications are underwhelming, I would argue, in their performance. But I want to look at why and really what that means. And so partly is like most certifications rely solely on third-party auditing. That's it, right? So they're missing the other 2 legs of that 3-legged stool, right? That is important. And then they kind of undermine that because there's conflicts of interest because most of the time the farm is paying for the third-party audit, right? So that automatically undermines the process. There's also the fact that most of these certifications, the user of the label has to pay for it. So, I mean, I'm talking millions of dollars paid to certifications in order to use the label, right? So there is a serious, and influence of them wanting to maintain that, right? And they need, again, it's the whole idea of we need the supply. I need that farm. We need that, right? And so there's a lot of conflicts of interest that occur that need to be managed. Not saying it can't be managed, but it needs to be managed. This leads us to another issue when I say that brand affection, right? So we'll do a little myth busting here. So this idea that consumers will pay for better welfare, especially when we put a certification on it, this is a big, fat myth. Oopsie daisy. Based on my experience in the supply chain anyway. So it's been proven, actually. We have plenty of actual consumer data. We're not gonna look at like research about what consumers tell us they want, right? If you ask me if I work out every day, I was like, yeah, I work out every day. I mean, that's what I mean to do. Like, do I actually work out every day? Not really. So if I ask any customer, would you pay for better welfare? Absolutely. But it never translates at the checkout counter, right? It never. And it is never going to translate. Small percentage, yes, but not a market share, right? So quality, right? It may pay, but quality always comes first. And there is a clear ceiling on price, okay? So this just has to be recognized. So I'm not saying it's not worth looking at, because I do think I may not be able to charge more, but we have proven that we can sell more. So that's where brand affection comes in, right? And I have yet to meet the CEO that doesn't want to sell more, right? We may not be able to raise the price, but if I can sell 2,000 of those units instead of 1,000, they'll be all over it, right? So that's the key. If I can make them reach for this brand instead of that brand, all other things being equal, if I have a choice to drive through that drive-through or that drive-through, which am I going to take? That's right. So I can drive brand affection, but I cannot, you'll never find me telling anybody that we're going to be able to charge 5 cents more or 10 cents more, right? So it's about driving a market share. And why is this? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this market failure idea. This is an adaptation of a visual that I like. Along here, we have animal welfare on the y-axis, and we have profit along the x-axis. And really here, this demonstrates the challenge that we have to face in managing animal welfare. So you see here, if we look at maximum welfare, that puts us in a not so great profit place, right? Also note that maximum welfare isn't at 100, because again, animal welfare is about the individual, and I have yet to figure out how to design something that makes everybody happy, right? That's that 100% are okay. So there's that, we have to have that realization. But the reality is the majority of systems focus on maximum short-term profit. That's our reality. And it's fair because most businesses focus on that, right? So I think recognizing this challenge is that we have corporations that are living and dying by a quarterly report, living and dying for shareholders who live on a 3-month timeline, are turning around and talking to farmers and asking them to operate like they can actually function on a long game. So they're diametrically opposed. I would say most of the industry standards put us at that acceptable level. So an example where I have it estimated animal welfare being a 70, 75, right? If 25% of our cows are lame, we're at that acceptable level, right? And that challenge is for farms to really manage welfare, it's a long game. And it's extremely frustrating when they are driven to deliver on maximizing profit. And by definition, if you're maximizing one thing, you're not going to optimize anything else. So optimize requires compromise. It's going to require compromise on profit. It's going to require compromise on welfare, right? And this is the one thing that seems to be missed across the board by most businesses, right? And admittedly frustrating for farmers because they're being asked to behave in one way, but driven to behave in another. Other drivers that I see that frustrate me, competing priorities, right? Animal welfare needs to be talked about across the business, marketing, sustainability, procurement, quality. It needs to be talked about in the C-suite. But when it is embedded in sustainability, it is competing for coffee. It's competing for attention. It's competing for recycling, right? So it makes it very difficult. If you're going to make progress in welfare, you need to have a dedicated team. And they need to have a voice to the top somewhere. That has to get linked up there, right? But that competing for priorities is always going to hamstring it if you have a team that's supposed to be focusing on all these other things. Willingness to overpromise and underdeliver. And this, I am just going to accuse every CEO and person in the fancy pants in the C-suite, right? What's their average horizon? 3 years, 4 years? They're just looking for the next bigger paycheck or the next job or the next fancy title or whoever company. They don't care. They're going to promise whatever. They're not going to be around to have to live up to whatever promise they made. They don't. So that's the challenge, right? So companies are willing to say big things, and then they're not going to be there. You might be, because you're going to live with it and figure out, like, how am I going to do that? And then the people that came after them, they weren't there for the promise, and so they're not giving you the support you need to do that. Quiet quitting. All right, this is what I've seen lately, right? So I think you can all appreciate, we continue to have undercover videos. They're not getting the reaction they used to. And we've also had corporate change that, again, the constant turnover of CEOs, they don't remember. Like the institutional memory of what it was like when the videos actually created chaos is gone. So they don't see the value in what we're doing. And quite frankly, some of y'all just did too good of a job. So it's really not a big of an issue, right? So they're cutting roles, they're getting rid of positions, and they're not providing the support they used to. And lastly is mistaking enthusiasm for expertise. If you're a lawyer, nothing against you, right? But the number of animal welfare programs or animal welfare things that are actually run by lawyers instead of animal welfare experts astounds me. And that's because animal welfare has become a legal liability because we make promises and we don't keep them, right? But again, Walmart, if you're here, you're not going to hire me as general counsel because I listen to a few podcasts and I'm passionate about the law, right? Hire the experts to do what they do. But again, make sure that every part of the business, animal welfare needs to be discussed at every part of the business. Because if you're not aligned with procurement, you're never going to make progress. You're just going to be fighting constantly because you didn't agree on what the goal was, right? All right, how much time do I have? I think I'm over, but I don't know when we start. Okay, I'm going to go through this. So why doesn't certifications work? Why don't they improve welfare? I can tell you what certifications do. They generate revenue for certifying bodies. They generate revenue for audit companies. They drive costs into the system. They create or amplify risk for the brand. They provide no transparency. They're there 1 day a year, so there's no oversight, the other 364, and there's no support. There's no boots on the ground to help farmers figure stuff out. And above all, animal welfare certifications have driven a culture of compliance rather than compassion, right? And that's our problem. I'm going to skip through some of these. So this is just another case study in Cook's Venture. Big takeaway here is, what did certification get us? This is the key of skin in the game, right? When push came to shove, nobody wanted to pay for it. And more importantly, when it was time to shut down, the certifiers didn't come. The certifiers weren't concerned for the welfare of the birds, right? And that's what I mean by skin in the game, from everybody, right? Industry standards, again, can mitigate risk if managed well. The challenge there is they do have second party supplemented often by third party, but there's no effective internal process that I've really seen execute. And my experience, again, is that they have tended to drive this culture of compliance over compassion. And again, this is where I think a meaningful program can accomplish all three. I'm going to hustle through this just so we can, right? So if we do this well, we can accomplish all three. And I just want to share some examples of sort of the how this makes it different, and then we'll give it back to you. Right? So this goes back to that idea of short-term versus sustained improvement. Oops, got too excited there. Why this matters. Focusing on sustained improvement is key because we have to outlast the corporate chaos and legislative chaos. Like moons ago, I would actually have told you that some of the legislation, like that's set in stone. I was never a fan of legislation because it's not adaptable and you can't, it doesn't catch up with science. Now, who knows, legislation, we just turn it on and off and decide we like it or don't like it. I don't know. So I'm not sure the point of legislation. But corporate chaos, and by that I just mean the constant CEO, the revolving door of folks moving on to the next thing. We can make a difference that lasts when we start with the ground up, when the ideas came from the farmer, when they came up with the solution, then it lasts. It's also recognizing that we don't have to have big change, right? Recognizing that better is better. We're not perfect. we're not talking about the ideal farm. I don't even know what that is. So working with what we have, working with each individual farmer, meeting them where they're at, figuring out how can we do that a little bit better? And then permission to believe, and that gets us to this last bit, is a lot of this is new to farmers. Like us, they've done what they've always done. That's nothing against a farmer. I use the same meatloaf recipe my mom taught me. Why? Because that's how I was taught to do it. It may not be the best one, but it's what I got, right? So farmers do what they do. So I'll give credit where credit's due. My work at Danone, we managed to get about $500,000 to work with farms on projects. 2 of the key farm projects that we did, we gave a brush as a reward. Every time we did an audit, a farm got a brush. And a lot of these farmers had never used brushes. And some of them were like, I don't need a stinking brush, Jen. They were just annoyed. They didn't like me anyway. I don't need your brush. And I tell them, well, hey, then just give it back. I got a waiting list of people who want brushes. And they were like, really? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, well, why don't you leave it? Maybe I'll put it up. And the video's not playing, but because you gotta watch a brush. But anyway, once the farmers saw the cows using the brush, they were like, I had no idea. I had no idea they liked the brush so much. And then I'd come back and I said, you want another brush? They're like, yeah. Can I have or where could I get those? And then part of it was learning and sharing with them where to put it, where not to put it, all these other challenges of some brushes work better than others. Maybe we don't want to put it in that pen. And so that was a great learning. So again, learning that farmers really need to see it for themselves. And the next project we did was shade. So this is a pet peeve of mine for whether it's feedlots or farms out with cows out on pasture or cows that are out on dry lots, out in the sun. I'll say, we don't have any shade. And if I heard it once, I heard it a million times. Farmers would tell me, my cows are used to it. The cows are used to the heat. And my answer was always, your cows are used to disappointment. That's all. There's a difference. And so we managed to get these fancy shades for some of our farmers. And we had these guys up in Idaho that were willing to try. Like, okay, prove me wrong. And we put those out there, and I was up there in Idaho. It was about this time of year, actually. It was a little warmer than normal. But I had taken some pictures, and they didn't turn out great. And I asked him, do you mind? Can I come back tomorrow and just really quick see if I can get some pictures? And he said, well, you can try, but it's going to be like 60 degrees tomorrow, Jen, so good luck. I showed up, and he came out and met me. And he's like, well, what do you know? Every damn cow is under the shade. And that was it opened his eyes. He's like, it's 60 degrees. I'm like, I knew they'd be there, but anyway, So they need to see for themselves, and they learn best from other farmers. So amplifying those other farmer voices. So as much as I like to sit and talk about welfare, I know that farmers do not want to hear from me. They do not care what I have to say, and that is okay. Farmers want to hear from other farmers, right? So let's amplify those voices. All right, so I will wrap up. Takeaways I hope you got from today. An audit is a tool, not a program. Oops, come on. All programs are not meaningful or created equal. Most importantly, audits don't improve welfare. People do. You're here from the supply chain. What should you do? I would say start asking serious questions about certifications, how you use them, how much you pay for them. Those supplier surveys that come out, asking your suppliers what they're doing. Man, I got lots to say about those, but that's a discussion for another day. Lots of money spent, nothing accomplished. Enforce the standard. Are you enforcing it? Are your suppliers enforcing it? You got to ask the right questions to unpack that. And most importantly, define your goals. Align with leadership. Decide whether you want to drive compliance or compassion align what the goals are for the company, and only then can you design a program that you can actually fund accordingly and execute. So with that, I don't think we have time for questions, so I'll just move to that, and we can around so we can chat later. Awesome.